Well, good afternoon. I'm Steve Pociask. I'm president of the American Consumer Institute. We're a 501c3 educational research institute. And today we're going to talk about broadband and issues involving competition and regulation and the benefits that it is derived for consumers. There's a couple seats up front here and a couple over there and one over there. Feel free to grab something. First, thanks to everyone. I really appreciate you coming out and sharing an hour here with us. So the brief purpose, when we think about information technologies, we all think about these little apps and all the little technology that's just changing everything that we do today. We think about healthcare and distance learning and teleconferencing and telecommunication, the e-materialization, the fact that people are able to download things in software, the health applications and distance monitoring and other things that are enabled as a result of both wireless and wireline broadband telecommunications. Today, we're going to address the evolution and potential for the Internet going forward, and as it relates to consumer benefits, competition, the role of regulation, and its many applications. But before getting further into this, I want to just take a moment here to hear from, we're in a bit from our panel, but before we do that, I want to hear a little bit from the author of the law that actually started this, essentially by commercializing the Internet itself. For those still arriving, there is a seat over here and one over to the back there. Please come on in. I appreciate you all coming. Yeah, former Congressman Rick Boucher, he served for 28 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Virginia's 9th Congressional District. And prior to his service in Congress, he was a member of the State Senate for 7 years. During his congressional tenure, he served on the House Energy and Commerce and Judiciary Committees and chaired the subcommittees on telecommunications, technology, and the Internet, as well as energy and air quality. He was the leading participant in every major telecommunications policy debate in the last 25 years. A subcommittee that he chaired oversaw the commercialization of the Internet and its transition from a government-owned R&D project. Essentially, he co-authored the 1992 law that permitted the first commercial use of the Internet, the topic of today. He was one of 2 co-founders of the Congressional Internet Caucus and served as co-chairman of the 170-member group for 15 years. His proposals to promote competition among telecommunication service providers is the core, really, of the 96 Telecom Act. Congressman drafted bipartisan comprehensive universal service fund reform legislation, as well as providing a baseline privacy rights for Internet consumers. He is currently a partner in Washington, D.C. office of Sidley Austin and head of the firm's Government Strategies Practices Group. He is also the honorary chairman of the Internet Innovation Alliance. Let me introduce the Honorable Rick Boucher. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Well, Steve, thanks very much. It's a privilege to be here today, and I want to thank you for the invitation to share some thoughts this afternoon. I'll just expand a little bit on that introduction and try to make sure that the total introduction isn't longer than the remarks turn out to be. But I would add that the Internet Innovation Alliance is what brings me here today. I'm the honorary chair of that organization. We're a membership organization, a not-for-profit. We are comprised of about 175 members, and our 175 members are a combination of nonprofit organizations, consumer organizations, and others that advocate the public interest. And we also have among our members some of the larger companies interested in broadband, and that would include, for example, Alcatel-Lucent, Corning, and AT&T, just to cite a few examples. I'm going to devote some time today. Steve asked that I keep these remarks to about 10 minutes and then leave some time for answering questions. I'll try to do that. And given the fact that it's a fairly limited time frame, I'm going to utilize that to talk about what I think is the greatest policy challenge in the broadband space for this year and next year, and possibly suggest a way forward in terms of addressing that policy challenge. There is an urgent need for more spectrum for mobile commercial communications. Mobile use is growing, even by the most conservative estimates, at something like 5 times the overall rate of growth in the general economy. And I will stress that those are just the most conservative estimates. You will see estimates all over the board in terms of the rate of growth of mobile data usage. And I guess it depends on what you're measuring and whether it's a specific part of the country that you're looking at. But the most conservative figure is 5 times the rate of growth of the overall national economy. That has led to a spectrum crunch in the major cities, where the mobile wireless carriers are now having difficulty having adequate spectrum in order to meet growing consumer demand. And that growing demand really comes from an increase every year in the overall number of mobile data subscribers as more people have smartphones and tablets connected to the web. And an even greater component of that growing use is the amount of data every subscriber consumes. A lot of the new applications that you have on your smartphone or your tablet will have a video component. And video downloading, of course, involves an enormous amount of data usage. And so as more people subscribe and subscribers use video much more frequently, we're having this enormous annual growth in the use of mobile data, leading to the spectrum crunch. That spectrum crunch exists to a very large extent in the largest cities. There is a need for more spectrum in rural areas, but the greatest example of the spectrum crunch, where it is the most acute, is in the more concentrated urban areas. And that also happens to be the place where you have a significant number of independent television stations that are not affiliated with the network, that perhaps have a small number of viewers. They have specialized programming, maybe it's old movies or reruns of syndicated programs. But because they have a small number of viewers, they're not making as much money as the network-affiliated larger television stations in those markets. And this nice coincidence of these two things, the fact that the greatest demand for new spectrum is in the concentrated population areas, and the fact that that is the very place where you find some of these independent stations not making a whole lot of money with over-the-air broadcasting, led Congress to a really innovative concept last year. That is called incentive auctions. And I'm going to take just a moment to describe what that is and the process for developing and launching the incentive auction as it will unfold over the course of the coming year. The idea behind incentive auctions is that broadcasters could be encouraged on a voluntary basis to donate their spectrum, or at least some significant part of it, for auctioning to the mobile carriers. And in return for that donation, the broadcasters would receive a share of the auction proceeds. This is where the notion of incenting their contribution comes from. Congress recognized that more spectrum was necessary, and also cleverly saw that there was a nice overlay of opportunity and need, with the smaller television broadcasters perhaps being willing to contribute their spectrum, thinking they might make more money from the incentive auction than from simply continuing to broadcast over the air to a fairly small audience. And so we now have that legislation signed into law, and the FCC at the present time is in the process of designing the incentive auction, which they hope to hold during the course of 2014, so just 1 year away. The auction is truly interesting. It is novel. This is original. This is new territory for the FCC, and it would be set up in this fashion. First, there would be a reverse auction in which broadcasters in a given market would compete against each other for donating spectrum into the auction process. And in a reverse auction, it is the low bid that wins. So the broadcaster willing to sell his spectrum for the least would prevail in the reverse auction. When the FCC then has collected spectrum from this donation process and knows how much spectrum it will have for auctioning and where that spectrum is located, it will engage in a process known as repacking, in which broadcasters that choose to stay on the air would potentially have to move to another channel. And the purpose of repacking would be to create a continuous swath of spectrum that would be attractive to the mobile bidders. They're not going to buy a little patchwork here, a little patchwork there. They would want something that is long and continuous. And so broadcasters remaining on the air might have to move their channels so that a large swath of continuous spectrum can be cleared. That is step number 2. It's the repacking exercise. Once that is concluded, and the mobile carriers can look at the band plan, look at the availability of spectrum, see where those continuous swaths are, there would be the third step, which is a forward auction of that spectrum out to the mobile carriers, and in the forward auction, the highest price prevails. That's the auction we're all familiar with, which is quite common. But that is the third step in this very novel and new process. The auction is expected to produce about $20 billion in revenue for the government. Now, this is a guess. It's something of an educated guess based on some analysis of broadcasters that might participate, but a guess nonetheless. The size of the auction receipt will depend to a large extent on how the rules are written for this auction. And the revenues are designed, I would note, to meet multiple needs. First of all, to compensate the broadcasters for their donation of spectrum. They would get a percentage of the auction proceeds, and so that will be devoted to the initial incentive to get broadcasters to contribute. Secondly, to reimburse the broadcasters for any relocation costs that they have associated with the repacking exercise. The promise has been made to them that from the auction proceeds, any costs they have in changing channels that might involve something like a new transmitter or having to rebrand and remarket would be reimbursed from the auction proceeds. And then the first responder network is going to be built out, at least in significant part, with a dedicated $7 billion from the auction proceeds that would be provided to localities on an as-needed basis through grant applications to NTIA for this $7 billion fund. So localities that can't afford to put that equipment into the network on their own could then apply, show their need, and potentially receive a grant from this $7 billion fund in order to build out for the first responder network, that fully interoperable network for fire, police, and rescue that will exist once this is done on a nationwide basis. And then finally, and very importantly, these auction revenues are designed to help reduce the budget deficit, and that was a major motivator for many members of Congress in voting for the incentive auction at the outset. So to meet these multiple goals for the use of revenues, it's essential that all bidders be welcomed into the process, and that carriers that want to bid for spectrum be allowed to do that. The larger the number of bidders, the higher the receipt in the auction that is forward out to the carriers, and the higher the receipt is, the more likely it is that broadcasters are going to be willing to contribute spectrum at the outset. They're going to want to have some assurance that the size of the receipt will be large enough that the percent they're guaranteed is going to be sufficient for them to donate spectrum in the first instance. These realities led the Congress last year to establish in the legislation authorizing the incentive auction a requirement that bidders not be precluded from that process. There are some who would argue that bidders, particularly the larger carriers, should be precluded as a way to favor others. The problem with doing that is, first of all, it's picking winners and losers, and secondly, it inevitably will diminish auction revenues, make it very difficult to meet these multiple goals for the revenues once they're received, and also make it very difficult for the carriers to be able to have the spectrum they need in order to serve the demand for their consumers. So allowing all of the carriers who need spectrum to bid for it helps not only the auction receipts, but also helps consumers in being able to remain with the carrier of their choice and have that carrier be able to meet their growing need for spectrum by having that spectrum made available. Hopefully, that clear expression of congressional intent will guide the FCC as it develops the rules for the incentive auctions. I say this is the major challenge that we have in the broadband space. It is, in fact, for the next 2 years, I think, the major challenge. And all eyes are now on the FCC as in the middle of a leadership transition, it undertakes this critical challenge of developing rules for the incentive auction. Now, I think I have used, if not exceeded, my 10 minutes. Steve, thank you. And Steve asked if I would take a question or two, and I'll be happy to do that if anyone has one. No questions. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Glad to be with you today.
So we have a really terrific lineup here of experts. Each of them are going to make a 5-minute statement, and then we're going to open it up for general discussion. Before we do that, let me just note that everyone should have received their bios. I'm not going to go through them at this time in the interest of time, and we're going to hear the speakers from my right to my left, and let me just go through them right now. First we'll have Harry Alford. He's the president and CEO of the National Black Chamber of Commerce. And then we'll have Hans Haney. He's a program director of technology and democracy and senior fellow for the Discovery Institute. Then third, we'll have Morgan Reed. He's the executive director for the Association of Competitive Technology. And then last, on my far left, is Ryan Radia. He's the associate director of technology studies for the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So again, the bios are in front of you, and with that, we're going to talk a little bit, just to set the stage here, continue to discuss a little bit about the broadband, both the wireless and the wireline side, about aspects of regulation and competition, the IP transition issue, and the like. So with that, Harry. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. For all Americans, and especially small businesses, broadband is today's gateway to greater economic and social prosperity. Whether through greater access to workforce development, healthcare information, or educational opportunities. Access to broadband delivers a wealth of information directly to our fingertips at home, at school, at work, and on the go. Broadband technology continues to reshape society, and the promises of the digital world are boundless. Expanding access to advanced telecommunications technologies and services will spark the creation of new service providers, innovations, and applications that will make technology more accessible for small business owners. For example, small businesses are increasingly utilizing broadband connections and internet applications to reach global markets, customers, and suppliers outside the traditional local and regional centers. Broadband has also changed the way people work. It allows those in remote communities to connect and conduct day-to-day business operations. The power of broadband also levels the playing field for small business owners and their employees who would not normally have the means or access to jobs or employment opportunities. Through services like telecommuting and video conferencing, broadband enables businesses to better manage costs and to employ people more efficiently. The broadband industry has continued to flourish as our economy climbs out of the recession. The broadband industry has collectively invested billions in research, equipment, and people over the past 2 years and shows no sign of reducing those investments, allowing for faster speeds, wider availability, and greater customer service. In fact, CNN Money reported that the internet accounted for $684 billion, or 4.7% of all U.S. economy activity in 2010. As a comparison, the federal government contributed $625 billion, or 4.3% to the nation's output. It's about the same. In 2011, U.S. investment in wired and wireless network infrastructure rose 24%. Thanks to the competition policies implemented in the 1990s by President Clinton and a bipartisan Congress, private companies have invested more than $1.2 trillion in state-of-the-art broadband networks, including $250 billion from 2008 to 2011. Investment in the broadband industry has been a catalyst for job creation. According to the McKinsey Global Institute, among 4,800 small and medium-sized enterprises surveyed, the internet created 2.6 jobs for each loss to technology-related efficiencies. John Irons, previously with the Economic Policy Institute and now with the Rockefeller Foundation, has also noted that approximately 12,000 jobs are created per $1 billion invested in wireless infrastructure. Broadband's impact on small businesses is clear. Every day, small businesses across the country are taking advantage of broadband networks to advance their business models and create jobs. The light touch regulatory approach taken in the 1990s by President Clinton and a bipartisan Congress in the early stages of broadband networks has fostered innovation, investment, and has enabled small businesses to compete in our digital economy. And let me say I'm very proud of our telecoms, of the American spirit in approaching broadband. When I first looked at broadband, we were rated number 22nd in the world. I went to Amsterdam, went to a restaurant, a deli, bought a sandwich and some orange juice, gave the clerk my credit card. She goes, "Choo choo, thank you, we'll see you." Yeah, it was done. I mean, it was lightning fast. I was out in Kenya, in the Masai Mara region, and went into a gift shop out there in the outback, and I noticed the credit card machine. I said, "Do you take credit cards here?" He says, "Visa and MasterCard, no American Express, too high on the charges." So it's everywhere. And we now are probably in the top 5 in the world, and the progress has been phenomenal and truly Americana. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Hans Haney with the Discovery Institute. Now, it may seem hard to imagine in this day and age, but back in the 1990s, virtually no one could conceive how telephone companies, wireless providers, and cable operators could possibly compete against one another in the real world. The conventional wisdom was that but for the Federal Communications Commission, telephone and cable companies were impregnable monopolies. Now, we still sometimes hear the monopoly or duopoly rap today, plus the complaint that a few other densely populated countries have better broadband than we do. And we're told that government could fix this. Now, setting aside whether we in the United States have the most dynamic and competitive communications marketplace in the global arena, which I think it does, what else could government do? How could government make this industry more competitive? Well, one idea that we hear about is that when the government awards spectrum, it could limit how much low-frequency spectrum any one particular wireless provider could acquire, so as to try to equalize the amount of low-frequency spectrum that all competitors have. Another proposal is that as we transition from legacy circuit-switched copper-based telephone networks to internet protocol-enabled broadband platforms, that competitors can be allowed access, same access they have for copper to fiber at regulated wholesale prices. I'm highly skeptical of authorizing the Federal Communications Commission to micromanage this industry, to pick winners and losers in an attempt to improve competition. In 1992 and 1996, Congress passed legislation allowing the FCC to micromanage the cable and telephone industries for the purpose of regulating prices and promoting competition, and both projects were unmitigated failures. Reed E. Hunt, who was the FCC chairman at the time, later admitted that the gains from cable price regulation were, quote, small for each beneficiary, the losses huge for the regulated. Cable regulation meant so little to the former, perhaps a hamburger a month, and so much to the latter, a difference of billions of dollars in foregone capital expenditure, that inevitably the regulator was buried under a mountain of resentment from an industry and its financiers, while mere pebbles of gratitude were proffered from the consumer advocacy groups. What indeed was the point of regulation, he asked, if the beneficiaries were neither thankful nor economically better off? Congress repealed cable rate regulation in 1996, but at that time it authorized the FCC to try to promote competition in the telephone industry. Pursuant to the 1996 Telecommunications Act, the FCC devised elaborate rules allowing new entrants to share incumbent telephone networks at regulated wholesale prices. Now, according to Robert Crandall of the Brookings Institute, this pro-competitive regulatory strategy was not only wasteful but unnecessary. Meaningful mass market competition did not develop through unbundled network elements or their platform. Instead, competition has developed in ways totally unanticipated by regulators, namely through unregulated wireless providers and cable broadband platforms. Despite the FCC's best efforts, retail competition was extremely limited and most of the new entrants went bankrupt. Along the way, billions of dollars were wasted updating back-office billing and ordering systems of the incumbents and on the marketing campaigns of the new entrants. Countless millions of dollars were spent on lawyers and lobbyists. And when the industry crashed, more than 500,000 jobs and over $2 trillion in market capitalization were lost. By 1999, there were calls for the FCC to try to promote competition in broadband. But this time, FCC Chairman William E. Kennard said, if we've learned anything about the internet in government over the past 15 years, it is that the internet has thrived quite nicely without the intervention of government. So the reason I think this brief history is relevant today, again, in the name of promoting competition, there are some firms and some so-called public interest groups advocating limits on how much low-frequency spectrum wireless providers can acquire and attempting to hijack the IP transition to extend mandatory network sharing at regulated prices from monopoly to competitive services. As the recent history shows, when the FCC has acted to promote competition, the results have been less than satisfying. Real competition has resulted from private investment that leads to innovation and not from regulation. As Congress considers telecommunications policy, it's important to remember that technological progress is very difficult to predict, and that special interests that tend to be the loudest are often heavily invested in the status quo and not in the future. Chairman Kennard noted in 1999 that sometimes people talk about broadband as though it is a mature industry. But no, he said, the broadband market is fertile but still undeveloped. The future is bright but still glimmering in the distance. We're about 50 meters into a race that is sure to be a marathon. Well, I think that may still be true today. There are technologies on the horizon that could lead to the transformation of both the internet and wireless services. Examples include infinite capacity wireless vortex beams and computers with quantum mechanical properties that can already solve complex calculations 50,000 times faster than traditional supercomputers, and in theory could perform exponentially faster than that. Now, quantum data is unlike bits represented by ones or zeros that the present internet was designed to transport. A quantum bit can represent multiple simultaneous values. We will need a way for transporting qubits from machine to machine, and no one knows what a quantum internet will look like. If these technologies sound fantastical, just remember that the technologies we take for granted today at one time were unbelievable as well. Now, in conclusion, we know that the IP transition is urgently needed because the legacy telephone network is unsustainable and it is siphoning off investment that is needed in modern broadband platforms that are capable of delivering voice, video, and data. Every wireless provider except Sprint requires more spectrum as soon as possible. Congress should address these priorities while resisting the temptation to let the FCC micromanage or pick winners and losers under the banner of promoting competition. If you study the history of this industry, you will see that competition follows private investment-led innovation that lowers the economic barriers to entry. Regulation only plays a catch-up role. That's why I think pro-competition policymaking is a refuge for scoundrels. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to try to de-nerdify this a little bit from what I heard today. How many of you actually understand what a packet switch network is or an IP network? Ryan, you can raise your hand. But other than Ryan, okay, great. So we've got 4 people in here. What's your name, by the way?
Allison.
Allison? All right, Allison, I'm going to give you, your name is Allison, but your number is 3. I'm going to do some translation. What's your name?
Jerry.
Jerry, hand these out to the room. In the back, go through. So Jerry's handing out packets. All right? Everyone just take a packet. Go around, take a packet. And when I say, I'm going to tell you it's time to send Allison a message. And what we know is, we know Allison, www.allison.com, has a number, and it's an IP address, and I've decided her IP address will be 3. In fact, it's probably something like 192.168. Blah, 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 blah. But for today, Allison, you're 3. So, everybody start moving the packets towards Allison. Guys, just hand them through. Ah, good, see? You handed it to somebody else served as a node, other people are serving as a node. Boom. So Jerry was my telecommunications provider, right? And distributed packets got the message back to Allison. Allison, put them in order. What does it say?
Can I have your pen?
There you go. Can I? No, it's okay. So what we just did, I just used packets to deliver a message to her. And I didn't care who had it. My telecommunications provider, Jerry, put the message out there, and you all act as nodes and connecting points to get the message to her. Now, when you hear these people talking up here about telecommunications and how do we move forward on it, I think there still is this understanding that instead of what you just saw, the telecommunications is this. That one-to-one, I hand her the same message. That there is this pipe going between us, a tube, so to speak, between Allison and me. And in fact, that's not the case. In fact, what you saw Jerry just do is in fact how things move forward. And here's the cool part. That includes for voice. Not just for stuff on your mobile app, but for voice communications. My voice is broken up into little tiny sections, into packets, that's sent throughout your entire world. It comes back to Allison. So when I verbally say to Allison on my phone, hey, Allison, can I have your pen? That just happened in this room all across the country. And I think it's really important when you hear the gobbledygook about telecommunications and IP switch networks and wireless transmission over wireline and lighting dark fiber, that ultimately what we're talking about is passing information from me to Allison in an efficient manner that utilizes resources in the smartest way possible. Because here's the crazy part. If I were to build a tube to Allison from me, one that was open and just for us to talk, it's incredibly inefficient. It's incredibly wasteful. You all did a perfect job of redistributing that information in an efficient manner rather than me assembling just one connection point over copper direct to Allison. So when we talk about why do we need telecommunications reform, why do we need all this stuff, well, what's going on? You heard Boucher talk about incentive auctions and making sure that we pay off the broadcasters, etc. What we're really trying to get to is a more efficient, cleaner way for me to say to Allison, can I have your pen? And whether it's over the phone, whether it's me texting her, whether it's me doing a video conference with her over FaceTime, the end goal is the same. What's the most efficient way to tell Allison that I want her pen? I don't really, but it's okay. So the practical implications of telecommunications reform is a more efficient delivery of simple messages. And you say, okay, that's nice, now what do I do with that? Here's the part you need to think about. Most of you guys are young, but some of you probably know old people, like me. How many of you know somebody who's had a knee replacement? A grandma, grandfather, Allison, thank you very much. How many of you have had knee replacements? Randy, your knee's still good?
Still good.
All right. The reality is now millions of Americans are getting knee replacement every year. Anyone know what the #1 determining factor of a successful knee replacement surgery is? Anyone? Anyone? It's not the surgery. Physical therapy afterwards. PT is the #1 determinant of an impactful and effective knee replacement surgery. All right. If you know old people, how often do old people like to get in their car and drive to go see a doctor and have somebody wrench on their knee for hours at end? They don't. They don't like to do it. So we in the tech industry said, well, instead of having to get grandma into the car and drive her to the doctor's office and sit in a waiting room and then wait to see a PT guy and have 30 minutes with the PT guy and then drive back home, how about if we could do it with a Connect where grandma is sitting in her favorite chair in front of the Connect and there's a PT specialist watching her range of motion via biomechanics on the Connect and say, good job, grandma. Go a little further this time, 1%. And you know what? I'll see you again tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So instead of having a PT appointment that you do once a week, you do a PT appointment every day. And remember, I said the #1 determining factor for a successful knee replacement is PT. But guess what happens? Remember that efficient message I just passed to Allison about can I have her pen? Now imagine that I have to do a video transmission from the PT specialist at the hospital to grandma in rural South Dakota, and I need to have instantaneous frame rates, and I have to have delivery of analytics to know, did grandma actually go all the way to 110%? Well, all of a sudden, instead of having just one line on that piece of paper is going to be filled with data. And so we're packing that information pipeline. Instead of having 5 pieces of paper, I'd have to give every single one of you a phone book's worth of information to pass to Allison to deliver the same kind of information. And so the problem that we're facing right now is IP networks are an efficient way to pass information, but the more cool information we want to pass, the more we have to actually add packets. More information, phone book to each one of you. And so when you look at the impact of this in your congressional district, it isn't just watching Justin Bieber videos. It's actually the ability to change the outcome for your grandparents or for that athlete so that their ultimate success on whether or not they can walk around on 2 limbs was done because we could efficiently pass video information back to the PT specialist from grandma's favorite rocker via the Connect to have an outcome where maybe when she wants to come and visit you, you don't have to put a wheelchair ramp up. And so when we talk about where we stand right now in the wireless spectrum space and we talk about how do we regulate IP networks, remember that what we are talking about regulating and what we are talking about finding a solution to is something that isn't just voice communications, isn't just text message. It is literally life-transforming information that I think we all know we need to do a better job with. And I will turn it over to Ryan, who will give us a bunch of statistics. But hopefully, we've gotten to the point now where you understand that it's a little bit bigger than just that telecommunications, voice communication that we all know and love.
Thank you. Thanks to the American Consumer Institute. So Harry explained the amazing things that broadband is doing today, and Hans explained some of the amazing things that we'll be able to do with broadband tomorrow, and Morgan handed out some pieces of paper.
All right, smart.
So I'll try to explain how we get from where we are today to where we want to be from a governance standpoint. There are a lot of rules that govern phone companies, as we all know. Some go back to 1996, some go back to 1934. The problem is that a lot of these rules that exist today make pretty much no sense. Whatever one thinks about how much sense they made in the past, it's hard to justify them today. So here's one of the many statistics I'll throw out. A decade ago, pretty much everybody had a regular, plain old wireline phone connection at their home. Some people had 2, one for the dial-up and one for regular phone calls. Today that number is actually down to 26%. The remainder is people who have wireless, or they get their voice from the fiber optic provider or cable company. Yet, these operators of plain old telephone systems are saddled with all of these rules that other companies aren't. Things like forced interconnection, as Hans explained, where they have to give access to competitors at wholesale rates. Unbundling. There's all of these technical legal rules that go on and on for hundreds of pages. So right now, some telecom companies want to stop operating this obsolete, outdated network. It's expensive, demand is dwindling, and it's really not competitive with what you can get from other providers. So there's this proceeding going on at the FCC that's being called the IP transition. The question is, how quickly will we get to a state where the firms that want to move forward and build better, more advanced networks and modernize their systems are going to be able to do that? The problem is that we have all these rules. Now, fortunately, one of the smart things that Congress did when it wrote our telecommunications laws is give the FCC the power to what's called forbear from regulating. The FCC doesn't always have to enforce a rule if it deems, among other things, that the rule is no longer necessary, that it's not in the public interest, and so forth. So there's this proceeding right now where the FCC is looking at proposals to conduct trials. Now, normally when a company wants to go to build a better product, to modernize its system, it doesn't have to go to a government agency and ask for special permission to conduct trials. It just does it. Maybe it'll do trials by itself, but it's going to be voluntary. But what we have now, because of this regulatory structure, is the FCC basically being the essential obstacle to what could be and will likely be a much better network of tomorrow. So unfortunately, even though the FCC is moving forward with this process and saying, okay, to the companies, you can proceed, it's doing so very slowly. It's going through a series of comments and asking for more information, and this is already dragged out for a year, and it's going to probably drag out for several more years. What this does is not just make it harder to get a landline, because no one really cares all that much about those anymore. What it means is that if a company is thinking about building a fiber optic network in an area where it's currently just offering copper on DSL, this structure creates disincentive to do so, because it means you might have to maintain the old copper network at the same time as you're building a new fiber network and have to operate two networks. Or there's always the risk, and the FCC has discussed this possibility publicly, that fiber could be re-regulated the way that the copper networks were back in the 1990s, where everything is the subject of forced unbundling. Now, there are lots of legal arguments that Randy and others have explained why the FCC probably doesn't have the authority to do a lot of these things, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be a particularly effective constraint on this or many other agencies. So we have to make policy arguments for why we want to allow companies to build better networks. We want fiber to grow and thrive so that it can compete with cable companies who, according to some people, are going to become the next monopolist if they aren't already. So we want to be fostering competition, and these old regulatory regimes get in the way of it. And this isn't just a problem with voice. Look at video. I spent a few too many hours over this past weekend watching Arrested Development on Netflix. The idea of accessing video over a platform that has no facilities, that isn't providing cable channels, that isn't a broadcaster, that wasn't something that Congress ever considered when it wrote the 1996 Telecommunications Act. Yet, the way we treat cable channels and so-called MVPDs, there are all these rules that, again, they've been called silos, and they are, but they're silos with differential treatment, where we'll say that some cable channels can't be bundled with a cable company that owns the channels, and if they do, they're governed by this additional set of rules. And even the Netflix example is also the subject itself of disparate treatment. So Netflix, according to the latest data, and correct me if I'm wrong, Morgan, it consumes about 1/3 of internet traffic.
At night.
At night. That's a huge number, and that's not a bad number. That's a good thing. That means people really want to watch Netflix, and that could change in 5 years. It could be Vudu or Hulu or something else. But this is a clear indication that people are moving toward new and creative ways of consuming video that we didn't used to see. Yet, the ordinary way, the traditional way that we price that is the content company Netflix basically pays to get its data to the core of the internet. This is the traditional way. And then the ISP, or in other words, the consumers, pay to get the data from the backbone of the internet to their home. That's the gist of it. Yet, why does that have to be the pricing model of the future? Why can't more creative agreements be negotiated? A lot of innovation isn't just about building the next big thing, the next new technology, the next widget, the next service. It's about figuring out how to monetize it, how to market it, how to create a business model that allows that innovation to become sustainable and become accessible. Yet we have the so-called open internet order, also known as net neutrality, which says essentially that if an internet provider goes to Netflix and actually wants to use some of its leverage, Netflix gets a lot more bargaining power because of the fact that it has no obligation to give its content to anyone, except for the antitrust laws, which are based on economic reasoning, unlike the net neutrality rule. Netflix has the choice whether to offer to tie its products, to offer exclusively to some ISPs and not to others. Yet internet providers don't have that kind of authority. So the point is that there are these rules that exist today, that some of which have been promulgated by the FCC on its own, others which originate out of laws going back to 1996 or 1934, not to mention all the compulsory copyright rules, which are a whole other set of laws that were created in an era of a completely different set of competitive realities that need to be revisited. The agency needs to be forbearing from regulation, and when they don't, Congress needs to step in and rewrite the law and say to the agency, to the FCC, that it cannot impede this transition to an all-IP world, to the packet switch world, because it is going to enable a lot of great things, but 5 years delay can be a real impediment to growth, to people using cool services. I mean, imagine if the internet today were 5 years behind where it is. You know, we wouldn't be using tablets. We'd still be using like razors or something. That's not the world we want to live in, and it's the job of Congress to make sure that government isn't standing in the way. And that's probably going to require rewriting some of the laws. There's a debate going on about how to do that. It's a challenge, but the reality is there is going to be a need for Congress to intervene in this market, because there's just not enough indication that innovation is going to be unleashed at the rate that it needs to be because of all these rules that stand in the way. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. So, I'm going to just take some time and ask a few questions and also engage the audience in some questions. Some really interesting perspectives. Really great panel today. Let me just start off. Many of us know Jeff Eisenack. He's done a lot of work, and he's kind of described the whole issue of competition in the internet ecosystem as sort of dynamic competition, in the sense that we have software and applications providers and computer manufacturers and applications manufacturers. We have the internet service providers, the cloud computing companies, and others, all kind of in the same pot, and in some ways providing both complementary services as well as competitive alternatives with one another in a sort of intra-industry rivalry. Now, the other side is we're always hearing the whole issue of the cozy duopoly and the threat of monopoly of the service, and when you look narrowly at the individual markets, you'll say, yeah, well, gosh, Google has 60-80% of the market, and this other telecom guy in a certain market with the cable guy, they have a large dominant share of the market. The issue really gets at this whole thing is, and sometimes this is what invites competition, is the market competitive enough? Do we have an issue of concentration? Would any of the panel like to address that issue?
Well, I think when we get to competition, I guess I have to split it into two camps. For me, my members are the ones who create the cool mobile apps that you use on your devices. That's my folks. And the reality is that you get a less satisfying mobile app today because there isn't enough bandwidth, wireless, wireside, mid-mile, and you name it. You today do not get the best possible product. That's because all the telcos and the stores have a limit of 50 megs if you want to get it over the wireless, and if you want a bigger app, you have to get it on your Wi-Fi. I'm sure if you've ever played with your apps, you'll have those that says you're not connected to your network. You need to go home to download it. Well, statistically speaking, for us, we see it's somewhere about 200 plus to 1. If you go over that, if you go over the limit, that 50 meg limit, you lose 200 downloads for every one you get. Going over that limit is is a death knell for most smaller apps. Now, big apps, obviously, that blow through that, they just live with that reality. But for small, single-purpose apps, you go over that 50 meg limit, you're dead. So you don't get the best experience you have today. And so when you ask the question of, is the cozy monopoly creating this problem, I'd say actually it's kind of the reverse. It's actually a problem of the spectrum that we have allocated. We heard kind of a bipartisan opinion on that from Congressman Boucher, who's a stalwart Democrat, and we've heard it from folks here on the table on the other side, that it's as much about the spectrum that we have access to rather than a cozy duopoly or market concentration. Because frankly, there's not enough pie to divvy up right now in this wireless space for us to actually meet the demands that you all have. And so when you ask the question of, is there too much coziness, I'd say no. I'd say actually the bigger problem we have is not enough pie for us to find out if there's too much coziness. Now, if we had all the spectrum in the world out there, and you could say, well, there's only 2 competitors, and customers aren't getting cool apps the way they want to, then we can have a separate discussion. But we're not at that point in the marketplace where we can look out and say, I'm getting everything I want in terms of delivery. So let's ask that question first, and then let's get to the question of whether or not we have too many dominant players, or too few dominant players, or not enough allocation to the customer. Because right now, you're not getting the best environment you have, and it has nothing to do with the number of competitors.
Could I add to that? I think there's a real danger in focusing on the number of competitors in any given market. I mean, if you think about it, Coke and Pepsi, for example, you can think of a lot of markets where there may be 2 competitors, but it's a fiercely competitive market. And I would argue that, in theory at least, a market with only 1 competitor can be extremely competitive. And the reason I say that is because when we analyze competitiveness, what we really care about is firms that restrict output in order to raise prices. In other words, conduct that harms consumers. But in a marketplace where the firms are investing billions of dollars in broadband, it's approximately $65 billion a year, and they're competing maybe not just on the basis of price, maybe they're competing on the basis of quality, maybe they're competing on the basis of adding new features, improving service. There are different bases of competition. But as long as firms are engaging in that kind of consumer maximizing behavior, I think that it is short-sighted to focus on the number of competitors only, or the relative size of competitors in a given market.
Yeah, I think we're trying to play Major League Baseball with minor league AA capacity. Spectrum is the key. Bandwidth, that is the key, and that's what we should be concentrating on.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, I mean, what can policymakers then do to encourage broadband investment, deployment, and market adoption? I mean, are there certain policies that, I mean, I think I've heard spectrum many times, and I think I've heard trying to speed this IP transition. Are there other issues that, or something along those lines that policymakers can do to help?
One example, one solution is address the problem of municipalities making it impossible for companies that want to build a better network to do so. In 2008, Verizon wanted to build Fios in Wilmington, Delaware. If I lived in Wilmington, I would have been pretty happy to hear that news. Today, there is no Fios in Wilmington, Delaware. The reason is because the city council refused to grant to reach a reasonable set of policies. It said it imposed build-out requirements, it imposed rigid customer service requirements where if there's an outage, it has to be repaired within 24 hours. These rules and the fact that municipalities have them makes it harder to build better broadband networks in huge parts of America. We've seen the Google method, which is brilliant if you're in one of those cities, which is instead of going to the city, let the cities come to you who want that network. But the policy change would be for Congress to step in and act. So we already have, for instance, rules that make it illegal for localities to interfere with putting up satellite antennas to get satellite television. Back in 2006, and I believe Congressman Boucher was involved with this, there was a real push in Congress for what's called nationwide franchise reform. This is an option that's seriously worth considering, that preempting municipalities from unreasonably hindering companies that want to build a network, want to lay fiber and build a better service. The wireless side is very important, so is the wireline side, and there are still obstacles, and there's no reason why there shouldn't be fiber optic service delivered in every major urban area, or at least there's no reason that couldn't happen in a few years, but for, in many ways, government getting in the way.
It may not be a federal question as much as it is. I think Ryan points out something really valuable. The federal government needs to make sure that it takes a very light touch on this. Encouraging the spectrum auctions to move forward is obviously something the federal government can do. But Ryan's right. A lot of this comes down to what's happening in states and localities. The bigger question is that so I think last year, and somebody else will correct me if I'm wrong, we saw AT&T or Verizon, I think either one of them spent somewhere around $15 billion on the kind of stuff you want them to spend money on, which is pulling cable, putting up towers, getting guys in hard hats to construct wireless facilities. That's a pretty hefty investment, multi-billion-dollar investment by both Verizon and AT&T that I know for sure. Sprint has done some of it as well. T-Mobile hasn't yet, but there's a possibility that they will start spending money on that. So you are seeing the companies putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak, to try to get customers bigger, deeper broadband in more places. I think the question that Ryan raises is that if they can't find a way to make that money back, then it's highly unlikely that they're going to do it in places like Wilmington, Delaware. So the question from the federal government, from your office's perspective, is more of a first do no harm position on this, and start saying, okay, do we need additional regulation around this space right now? What is the harm that we are currently trying to prevent, and is the upside greater? And start from that position. On localities, I think, Ryan, you raise a really good point, and that is something for almost a separate conversation, maybe in state capitals.
Yeah, I just to add in there's a couple of examples of where you can kind of see the local meddling with and state level as well with the build out of some of these information technologies. For example, I was in Georgia a couple months ago, and there was a hearing on the placement of cell sites. Here's an example where to build a cell site can take 2 to 3 months, but it can take up to 2 years to get the permitting. It's ridiculous, and so people are saying, "Can you hear me now?" But the reality is the biggest obstacle to getting these things in place and rolling it out. It's not like the investment isn't there. Sometimes it's the paperwork and the extraction of fees required to do that. And about extraction of fees, just the taxation of these services are sometimes the highest. When you look at cable franchise taxes, telecommunications, probably running about 17%, and there's probably 6 states on wireless taxes. These are end user taxes, not company taxes, that are over 20%. Over 20%. Can you imagine? You go buy a cup of coffee and you're looking at paying 5 or 7% tax as an end user, a sales tax. But when you go to Baltimore County and you're paying your taxes, but then you just go across to Baltimore City and you'll see a $4 tax per line. So I have my family plan, and I have, say, 4 lines where I'm trying to add, so I have a latchkey kid who I want to keep in contact with after school, and I have to pay an extra, $20, or $16 just to connect, because the difference between Baltimore County and Baltimore City, and it's that kind of thing, I believe, that sometimes it becomes a real obstacle. It is a state and local problem to a large degree. Are there other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Could I answer a related question?
Oh, sure.
So the related question is, well, what would happen if we just jumped this whole regulatory overhang from the monopoly era? And I'd just like to commend your attention to 2 recent studies, one by Jeff Eisenach and Kevin Caves. They've shown that telephone rates are lowest in the 12 states where phone service has been deregulated completely, and highest where it's regulated the most. And secondly, a study by Sherry Lichtenberg. She conducted a survey for the National Regulatory Research Institute. The 35 states and municipalities responding to the survey reported primarily minor price increases and the elimination of some basic service requirements, but no state reported that a carrier had withdrawn service from a location they deemed unprofitable or had forced customers to move from traditional wireline service to wireless. only or to another carrier. Finally, there has been no spike in customer complaints, including complaints regarding slamming, billing, or failure to provide service. No state reported that a deregulated carrier had stopped providing wireline service in areas where it was the provider of last resort.
Thank you. Randy?
Hi, Steve. Thanks for those great presentations. They were really good.
Let everyone know who you're from.
Randy May with the Free State Foundation. So I just want to follow up on something that Ryan talked about when you highlighted the forbearance provision that's in the Communications Act. So, you know, if we accept the premise, which I do and a lot of you do, that the FCC hasn't granted as much regulatory relief as it ought to in light of the, you know, competitive environment. We can debate, you know, exactly how much or whatever, but, you know, that it's been too pro-regulatory. I just want to highlight the forbearance provision, and if I have to, I'll ask a question at the end, but the forbearance provision, you know, it looks like almost everyone here is a congressional aide, perhaps, and so you guys, I hope you'll think about this. The forbearance provision is really unique among regulatory statutes. It says that the FCC cannot apply statutory provisions or regulations if it makes certain findings, and you don't see that provision. That was added in 1996. So, and it has to just meet a couple of criteria, substantive criteria, that if it grants forbearance, that consumers are still protected and it doesn't injure competition and is consistent with the public interest. So those are the findings. So here's the point. The FCC, given this power, rarely uses it. I mean, not nearly as much as it should. So when Ryan talked about Congress doing something that I've suggested for several years now, is there could be a simple amendment to this forbearance statute. This is Section 10 of the Communications Act, to the effect that when a petition is filed seeking forbearance, that absent clear and convincing evidence to the contrary, that the petition has to, the FCC has to grant that petition. And that doesn't change the substantive criteria in the statute at all. They're still there, but it just establishes a rebuttable presumption that's deregulatory. So I just want to call that to your attention as something to think about. I've written about it a lot, so I can ask, you know, and be consistent with whatever the House rules are. Does anyone up there agree with that notion that Congress could do something like that that would be fairly simple and change the forbearance statute so it would actually mean something, more than it currently means?
I strongly support it.
Okay. That's my pitch. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just one thought. You know, I'm a member of the FCC's Consumer Advisory Committee, and I'm on their task force for the IP transition. And I'm sometimes amazed, because I've heard a couple of the panelists raise this point, I'm sometimes amazed by the fact that the regulatory rules require this redundant network. So you have on the one side, we want faster, faster internet, lightning speeds, and the other side, we maintain this duplicative network that's copper-based, you know, with 56 kilobit, you know, voice services over it. And so, what I'm lost to understand is why there isn't a sort of a realization that by having to maintain and invest both, that we get less of either. But I don't know if anyone else had any other thoughts about that, or I'll just open it up for further questions. Anybody have any questions, by the way? For the panelists? Yes.
My name is Ricardo Bird with the National Association of Neighborhoods. One of the areas we are working is in the city of Detroit. What does the panel think of the concept of a IP empowerment zone? So we are constantly hearing the capabilities of the industry to do wondrous things, to have demonstration sites around the country where we could demonstrate absent many of the regulations that are impediments.
Well, I think one of the things that you have to look at with Detroit, it's particularly interesting, as you know, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office has moved offices there to try to drive the other side of IP, intellectual property advantages in Detroit. I think there's a lot to be said for how do we maximize the value, the perceived value of this transition to cool smartphones. If you look at urban communities, they actually have a much higher percentage of smartphones than they do PCs in their household. So the big transition, and you've heard this a lot from the Joint Center and some of the work that they've done, has looked at the fact that we aren't having a hard time getting these devices into urban centers like Detroit. What we're still having a transition of is demonstrating the value of them. So we all talk here, and I can give a speech about knee replacement surgery, but getting it into the hands of somebody who has a smartphone and says, oh, you know what, I can do more with this. How do I find a job? How do I find a place to eat? How do I find these services like Yelp and others? And so there's a two-stage process. We can put high-speed broadband into urban areas ad nauseum, but you've actually got to partner with the local community to find out how do you meet those needs. So one of the things that we've worked on kind of quietly with some folks out of Verizon and other places is there are some food deserts that still exist in New Orleans post-Katrina, still. And so looking at ways to build a mobile app for one of the grocery stores that come up there so that members of the community in New Orleans get a text message saying, we're having a sale on bananas. Why? Because they don't want the bananas to rot. So there's a business interest on it. But two, it's alerting people to low-cost savings on better quality food. But it's not so easy to say, let's just set up some demo projects. Because unless you get the community to say, I want that, or I need that, or I can't live without it, I think that's the part of that equation that needs to happen. So I'd put the message back to you and say, help us identify the things that are needed, and then let's figure out ways to pilot the outcome, not the network itself. Love piloting the network, but in my view, it's all about outcomes.
Detroit's a tough one, man.
Yeah, decreasing population, you know, it's just...
They don't have a brand name supermarket in the city.
I know, it's horrible.
You got to go to Macomb or Oakland counties. I bought my first home in Detroit in '78 for $40,000.
Wow.
Today it's worth $41,000. You're talking about a city council that you have 9 city council people all at large. Nobody represents a particular neighborhood except that one neighborhood where all 9 city council people live. So this is true. This is literal. And usually 2 or 3 of them go to jail every 2 or 3 years trying to shake down business investors. Wow. You got a problem there.
Good question. Anyone else have anything else? Panelists, is there anything else that you wanted to mention? Any other issues?
I think the only thing that's worth noting is, since most of you are congressional offices, we did a study last year for the House Energy and Commerce Committee looking at the distribution of mobile app developers. So the cool apps that you run on your phone. What we found is they are not only built in Silicon Valley and New York City. In fact, we looked at the top 800 apps and looked at them based on where the companies were. And we found that only about 60% were in the entire state of California, but the rest of them, vast majority of them, were spread throughout the US. And there were some interesting niches. So, for example, in education software, the Southeast was actually a leader in mobile apps around education. We found a big concentration in the Midwest on healthcare apps around Chicago and going down from there. So when you go back to your district and you're looking at how does this wireless footprint affect my boss, the answer is I promise you, and if you call me up, I will give them to you. I can tell you a mobile app developer that's in your district, because I've got them for every district in the country, who's currently working on a product that's delivered over this device, or even your device. Yeah. And so it does have a direct impact on your district, regardless of the size, the scope, the urban versus rural nature of it. If you've got a farming district, I promise you that practically every farmer in your district of any size has probably GPS trackers mounted in his tractors. Everyone's doing that. There are RFID tags that tie into a mobile device for cows, so you can keep track of the weight on your cows. You run them through the scale, you tag it, you move on. Every one of your districts has a mobile app developer and a community that's using it right now, and they're dependent on an effective wireless IP network to make that happen.
Very good. So, any last questions? Anyone? So, hey, look, I want to thank the panelists. You did a great job. Very interesting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for being my foil, by the way.
Oh, no problem.
You actually said